35 years old, and I've spent the last 7 years building myself back up from nothing. And I mean nothing. Not for closure, not for healing, not for any of that forgiveness garbage people love to preach about. I did it so that when this exact moment came, I'd be ready. And let me tell you, I was so ready. Let me back up because you need the full picture to understand why what I'm about to tell you isn't just justified. It's been years in the making. 7 years ago, I was unemployed. Lost my job in tech during a round of layoffs. Burned through my savings trying to find something comparable. Ended up taking whatever work I could get just to keep my apartment. My family knew all of this because I made the mistake of being honest with them. I thought that's what family was for, right? Support during hard times. Yeah, turns out I was the punchline to every family gathering I wasn't invited to. I found out the hard way during Christmas 2018 when I showed up early to help my parents set up. I heard my sister Emily talking to my mom in the kitchen about how pathetic it was that I'd shown up with store-bought cookies instead of something homemade. My mom, the woman who raised me, laughed and said at least I was trying to contribute something, even if it was cheap garbage from the discount rack. My dad chimed in asking if anyone had cash to loan me since I'd probably ask before dessert. They all laughed. My uncle Gustavo, my aunt Bonnie, even my sister's husband, who I barely knew. I stood there in the hallway with a box of decorations in my hands, listening to them tear me apart for a solid 10 minutes. I left the decorations by the door and walked out. Didn't say a word. Drove home and sat in my apartment that night thinking about every family gathering I'd ever attended. Every time they'd been just a little too quiet when I walked into a room, every inside joke I wasn't part of. It all made sense suddenly. I wasn't family to them. I was their failure story. The cautionary tale they'd tell their kids about not ending up like Uncle Clark. So I made a decision right then. I wasn't going to confront them. I wasn't going to cry or beg or ask why. I was going to become everything they claimed I wasn't, and I was going to wait for them to need me. Because that's the thing about people who look down on you. They always eventually need something. I spent 2019 working 3 jobs, drove for a ride-share service during morning rush hour, did freelance web development in the afternoons, worked retail on weekends, slept maybe 4 hours a night, saved every single penny that wasn't rent or basic food. By 2220, I had enough to invest in cryptocurrency before it exploded. Sold at the right time, rolled it into index funds and a couple of small rental properties in neighborhoods that were just starting to gentrify. Meanwhile, I kept showing up to family events like nothing happened. Brought my cheap pies, wore my old clothes, drove my beat-up 2008 Toyota Camry, let them think I was still struggling, and they ate it up. Every single gathering, someone would make a comment. Emily loved to ask if I was still looking for real work or if I was happy doing my little computer stuff. My dad would mention job openings at his friend's warehouse like he was doing me this huge favor. Mom would pack me leftovers with this pitying look like she was feeding a stray dog. I smiled through all of it, thanked them, played the part perfectly. By 2022, I owned 3 rental properties generating solid passive income, had a 6-figure investment portfolio, and had started doing consulting work that paid more in a month than my old job paid in 6. I bought a house in a nice neighborhood 30 minutes from where my parents lived. Nothing flashy, but it was mine, paid in cash. I furnished it minimally because I didn't want to draw attention. But I made sure everything I bought was quality, the kind of stuff that lasts. I still drove the Camry to family events, still brought store-bought pies, still dressed like I shopped at thrift stores. My family had no idea that the failure they loved to mock had more money than all of them combined. The whole time I was waiting, I knew eventually they'd need something. A loan, a place to stay, help with a crisis. And I knew that when they came asking, they'd realize too late that the loser they'd spent years degrading was the only one in a position to help them. That's when I'd have my moment. That's what I'd been building toward. But I didn't expect it to happen the way it did. Thanksgiving last week, I got the usual text from my mom telling me dinner was at 2 and not to be late. I showed up at 1:30 with my contribution, a pumpkin pie from the grocery store bakery section, $12. I parked on the street and walked up to the house. The front door was unlocked like always, so I was about to walk in when I heard voices from the kitchen. Loud voices. I stopped with my hand on the doorknob. My mother's voice came first, sharp and clear. That pathetic loser's coming. There goes everyone's appetite. Still unemployed at 35, I froze. The pie box crinkled in my hands. My father responded, his voice carrying that tone he used when he was trying to be funny. Worthless deadbeat. Probably wants money again. Let's eat fast so he'll leave. I should have burst in right then. Should have thrown the pie at them and told them exactly what I thought, but I didn't. I just stood there and listened. Emily's voice cut through next, high-pitched and delighted with her own cruelty. Remember when he cried at Christmas like 6 years ago? What a joke. Still brings those cheap pies like he's contributing. I swear he finds the saddest-looking ones in the discount bin. Uncle Gustavo laughed. That booming laugh he had that always made me think he found everything hilarious. Every family needs their failure story. At least he makes us look successful. Can you imagine what our friends would think if they knew we had someone like him doing this? Aunt Bonnie added her piece, quieter but just as vicious. I can't believe we still pretend he's family. Should have cut him off years ago. He's just embarrassing at this point. They kept going. Made jokes about my clothes, my car. Speculated about whether I was living in my car or couch surfing. Wondered out loud if I was mentally stable enough to be around the kids. Every word was another nail in the coffin of whatever relationship we had left. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes total, listening to them absolutely destroy me. And you know what I felt? Relief, because this was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Not the confrontation I'd imagined, but something better. Confirmation that I'd been right all along. They'd never cared, never would care, and now I didn't have to pretend anymore. I walked back to my car, put the pie in the passenger seat, and sat there thinking. I could drive away and never come back. That would be satisfying in its own way, but it wouldn't be enough. They needed to understand what they'd done. They needed to feel it. So I waited 15 minutes, then walked back up to the house with the pie. This time I knocked loud. My mom answered with this big fake smile. Clark, honey, you're here. Come in, come in. We're just finishing up prep. I walked into that kitchen, and you could feel the tension immediately. Everyone was there. Mom, Dad, Emily, her husband Nathan, Uncle Gustavo, Aunt Bonnie. They all turned to look at me with these forced smiles, and I wanted to laugh in their faces. But I didn't. I set the pie on the counter and sat down at the table like nothing was wrong. Dinner was exactly what you'd expect. Turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, the whole traditional spread. They asked me surface-level questions about my life, and I gave surface-level answers. Yes, still doing freelance work. No, nothing steady yet. Sure, I'd love to hear about that warehouse position again, Dad. Emily sat across from me, smirking every time someone made a subtle dig. Nathan looked uncomfortable but didn't say anything. My uncle kept refilling his wine and making increasingly pointed comments about ambition and drive. My aunt just watched me with this expression like she was observing an interesting bug. I ate slowly, complimented the food, asked about their lives, acted interested in Emily's new promotion at her job, in my parents' plans to renovate their bathroom, in my uncle's latest golf tournament. I was the perfect dinner guest, attentive and engaged and completely non-threatening. And the whole time I was thinking about what came next. Dinner ended around 5. I helped clear the table despite my mother's half-hearted protests. Washed some dishes, made small talk. Then I thanked them for having me, grabbed my pie that no one had touched, and left. I drove home thinking about the conversation I'd overheard. The words kept playing in my head on repeat. Pathetic loser, worthless deadbeat. Should have cut him off years ago. Every single person in that house had agreed I was nothing. Had laughed about it. Had enjoyed tearing me down. They had no idea what was about to hit them. I got home around 6 Mo's, parked in my garage, and went inside. Then I started making calls. See, here's what my family didn't know. That warehouse my dad kept mentioning, the one his friend owned. I'd bought the property it sat on 2 years ago through an LLC. The friend rented the space from me without knowing who actually owned it. His lease was up for renewal in January, and I'd been planning to increase the rent to market rate, which was substantially higher than the sweetheart deal he'd been getting. But now I had a better idea. My second call was to the property management company that handled my rental properties. One of those properties was a duplex I'd bought specifically because my uncle Gustavo had mentioned years ago that his daughter Skylar was looking for an affordable place near the university she attended. She'd been renting one half of my duplex for 18 months and had no idea her actual landlord was her loser cousin. Her lease was also up in January. My third call was to my sister's employer. I didn't work there, but I'd done consulting work for them 6 months ago on a contract basis. Still had contacts in their HR department. Just wanted to check in, see how things were going. Casually mentioned I'd be interested in taking on more projects if they had anything available. The woman I spoke to, Kay, remembered me and said they'd definitely keep me in mind. I wasn't doing anything illegal. I was just positioning my pieces on the board. The actual game would start when they came to me, and they would come to me because that's what people like them always do when they need something. I spent the rest of Thanksgiving evening organizing documents, lease agreements, property records, investment statements, business registrations. I wanted everything ready to go. Then around midnight, my phone started ringing. My mom. I let it go to voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Third time I picked up. Clark, honey, are you okay? You left so quickly after dinner. I told her I was fine, just tired, long day. She said she'd noticed I'd seemed quiet and wanted to make sure everything was all right. I said everything was perfect, thanked her again for dinner, and ended the call. She bought it completely. They all did. Because they'd spent so long seeing me as this pathetic figure that they couldn't conceive of me as anything else. The real turning point came 3 days later, Monday morning. I woke up to 17 missed calls and about 30 text messages, all from various family members, all frantic. My dad's texts were the most desperate. Clark, call me back immediately. It's urgent. We need to talk. This is serious. Emily's were more aggressive. Where the hell are you? Pick up your phone. This is your fault. My mom's tried to be diplomatic. Sweetheart, please call when you can. We have a situation and need to discuss it as a family. I made coffee, took my time, read through every single message carefully, and then I understood what had happened. My uncle Gustavo's daughter Skylar had called him crying because she'd received an eviction notice from her landlord. Not an eviction exactly, but notice that her lease wouldn't be renewed and she had 60 days to vacate the property. She was in her last year of university and couldn't afford market rate rent anywhere else nearby. She'd been paying below market rent because the property owner had kept rates low for years. But now the property was being transitioned to a new management structure, and all below market leases were being terminated. The property owner was listed as an LLC that nobody in my family had ever heard of, an LLC that I controlled. Gustavo had called my parents, freaking out because his daughter might have to drop out of school if she couldn't find affordable housing. My parents had then called Emily because she was supposed to be good at this kind of thing, being in management. Emily had looked into it and discovered something interesting. The LLC that owned Skylar's duplex also owned the warehouse property where my dad's friend worked. And that friend had just been informed his rent was doubling when his lease renewed in January, which meant he'd either have to close his business or let half his workforce go to afford it. My dad was likely to be one of those layoffs since he was one of the oldest employees, and his position was redundant with two younger guys who worked for less money. But here's where it got really interesting. Emily had gone digging into the LLC's registration, and somehow, I still don't know how she managed this, she'd traced it back to me. Maybe she found a document I'd signed personally instead of through my lawyer. Maybe she recognized an address. Doesn't matter. She figured it out, and instead of calling me directly to confirm, she'd told the entire family, sent a group text to everyone showing the business registration with my name on it, added a message calling me a vindictive piece of garbage who was sabotaging the family over imagined slights. That's why my phone had exploded with messages. They knew. They all knew. And they were pissed. I sat in my kitchen that Monday morning, drinking my coffee and reading their increasingly unhinged messages. And I felt something I hadn't felt in 7 years. Pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. They'd finally figured out that the loser they'd been mocking had power over their lives. And they had no idea how much worse it was going to get. I didn't respond to any of the messages. Not that day. I went about my normal routine. Hit the gym, worked on a consulting project, made dinner, let them stew in it. Around 8 p.m., my doorbell rang. I checked my security camera, and there was my entire family standing on my porch. All of them. Mom, Dad, Emily, Nathan, Gustavo, Bonnie. They looked frantic. I opened the door and my dad immediately started. We need to talk right now. You're going to explain what the hell you think you're doing. I looked at each of them standing there in my doorway. My mom looked like she'd been crying. Emily was vibrating with rage. Gustavo kept clenching and unclenching his fists, and I felt absolutely nothing except vindication. I told them we could talk, invited them inside, led them to my living room with its comfortable furniture and artwork on the walls, the kind of space that clearly belonged to someone doing well for themselves. Watched their faces as they looked around and realized just how wrong they'd been about my situation. We all sat down and I waited, let the silence stretch out. Finally, my dad spoke. He said I needed to reverse whatever I'd done with Skylar's lease and the warehouse property. That this was family, and family took care of each other. That whatever I thought they'd done to upset me, this wasn't the way to handle it. I asked him what exactly he thought he'd done to upset me. He looked confused, said he didn't know. That's why we needed to talk about it like adults. So I told him everything. Starting with Christmas 2018 and what I'd overheard, moving through every comment, every dig, every moment of casual cruelty over the past 7 years. And then I got to Thanksgiving, repeated back to them word for word what I'd heard standing outside that kitchen door. My mother went pale. Emily's husband looked horrified. Gustavo tried to bluster. My mom started crying for real and saying they didn't mean it, that it was just talk, that families joke around like that. I asked her if it felt like a joke when she said I was an embarrassment. Asked Emily if she was joking when she said they should have cut me off years ago. Asked my dad if he was being funny when he called me a worthless deadbeat. They had no answer to that. Then Emily tried a different approach. Said that even if they'd said those things and she wasn't admitting they had, but even if they had, that didn't give me the right to destroy their lives. That Skylar was innocent in all this and didn't deserve to lose her housing. That my dad didn't deserve to lose his job. That I was being cruel and vindictive over hurt feelings. I looked at her for a long moment and then said 4 words that I'd been saving for 7 years. Just like you were. The room went silent. My dad tried to argue, said this was different, that I was actively harming them while they just said some words. I pointed out that those words had been said for years, that they'd shaped every family interaction we'd had, that they'd all agreed I was worthless. And now they were discovering I was the only one in a position to help them. And suddenly that worthlessness mattered. They tried every angle, guilt, anger, bargaining. My mom begged. Gustavo threatened legal action until I calmly explained that everything I'd done was completely legal, and he had no case. Emily promised they'd never talk about me that way again if I just fixed this. I told them all to leave, said I'd think about their situation and get back to them. They didn't want to go, but I insisted. Walked them to the door and closed it behind them. That was Monday night. It's now Friday, and I haven't responded to any of their calls or messages. And tonight at 3 a.m., I got woken up by screaming outside my house. I looked out my window and there they were. All of them standing on my lawn yelling, "Open the door, please." We didn't mean it. Don't do this. My neighbor's lights were starting to come on. Someone's probably going to call the police. And I'm standing here in my bedroom watching my family completely fall apart because they finally understand that actions have consequences. The thing is, I haven't actually done anything yet except not renew some leases and charge market rates for my properties. That's standard business practice. But they're acting like I've destroyed their lives already because they know what's coming. They know I have the power to make things so much worse. And honestly, I'm just getting started. The 3 a.m. screaming session on my lawn was just the beginning of this absolute circus. The police showed up around 3:20 a.m. 2 officers, both looking extremely tired and not thrilled to be dealing with what probably looked like a domestic dispute. My neighbors had called them, which I expected. What I didn't expect was my mother to immediately start crying and telling the officers that I was holding something of theirs hostage, and they just wanted it back. I came outside in my pajamas and calmly explained that these were my family members, that there was a disagreement about some business matters, and that they'd shown up uninvited in the middle of the night. Showed the officers my ring camera footage of them screaming on my lawn. One of the cops asked my family to leave, and they actually tried to argue about it. Tried to explain that this was a family emergency, and they needed to speak with me right now. The officer was not impressed. Told them they could handle their family business during reasonable hours, and that if they didn't leave immediately, they'd be cited for disturbing the peace. My dad started to say something else, but Gustavo grabbed his arm and they all left. Piled into their cars and drove away while I stood there on my porch watching them go. The officers asked if I wanted to file a report. I said no, just wanted it documented in case they came back. They gave me an incident number and left. I went back inside and didn't sleep for the rest of the night because I was too wired on adrenaline and vindication. Here's what my family didn't know. They weren't just upset about Skylar's housing situation and my dad's potential job loss. There's way more going on that they're panicking about. When Emily went digging into my LLC's holdings, she didn't just find the duplex and the warehouse. She found all of my properties, including the strip mall where her husband Nathan's small business is located. He runs a specialty coffee roasting operation, has a lease on one of the units, and apparently that lease is also up for renewal in February. The current rent is below market because the previous owner was old and hadn't raised rates in years, I bought the property in 2023 specifically because it was undervalued and had potential for higher returns. Nathan had no idea his wife's loser brother-in-law owned the building where he'd built his entire business. Emily didn't tell me this during the Monday confrontation. I found out Tuesday morning when Nathan himself showed up at my door alone, looking absolutely wrecked. He rang the doorbell at 7 a.m., and I almost didn't answer. But then I saw through the camera that he was by himself, and I was curious. Opened the door, and he just stood there for a second before asking if we could talk. I let him in, made coffee because, honestly, I felt a little bad for him. Nathan's always been quiet, kind of stays out of the family drama. Never participated in the mockery as far as I knew. We sat at my kitchen table, and he told me everything. His business was barely profitable. He'd sunk his savings and a loan from his parents into getting it started 3 years ago. The below-market rent was the only reason he could afford to keep operating while building a customer base. If his rent doubled or even increased significantly, he'd have to close. He'd lose everything, and Emily didn't know how bad the finances were because he'd been hiding it from her, trying to project success while barely staying afloat. He wasn't there to beg exactly, more like he was laying out the facts and asking what it would take for me to renew his lease at a reasonable rate. He acknowledged that what my family had said about me was horrible. Said he'd been uncomfortable during many family gatherings, but hadn't spoken up because he didn't want to cause problems with Emily's family. He looked genuinely ashamed about that. I asked him why Emily didn't know about his financial situation. He said she'd quit her previous job to take the management position at her current company, based partly on his assurances that his business was doing well, and they'd be fine with one income during the transition. If she found out he'd been lying about the business's profitability, it would destroy her trust in him. He'd been planning to tell her once he got profitable, but that kept not happening. We talked for almost an hour. He answered every question I asked honestly. Didn't try to minimize what my family had done. Didn't make excuses. Just explained his situation and asked what I wanted from him. I told him I'd think about it. He left, and I sat there with my coffee realizing that Nathan's desperation added a whole new dimension to this situation. Because Emily had no idea how vulnerable they actually were. She thought Nathan's business was successful, thought they were financially stable, had been making plans based on that assumption, and if I chose to, I could expose that lie while simultaneously destroying the business. 2 birds, 1 stone. Wednesday, things escalated in a direction I genuinely didn't anticipate. My mother called me Wednesday afternoon. Not frantic this time, calm, asked if she could come over to talk. Just the 2 of us. No drama, no yelling, just a conversation. I was suspicious but agreed. She showed up an hour later looking exhausted. We sat in my living room and she started crying before she even said anything. When she finally spoke, she told me she understood why I was angry. Said she'd spent the last 2 days thinking about all the things they'd said over the years and how it must have felt to hear them talking about me that way on Thanksgiving. She wasn't making excuses but wanted me to understand where it came from. According to her, I reminded my father too much of his own brother, who'd struggled with addiction and unemployment for years before dying in his 40s. My dad had always been terrified I'd end up the same way. And when I lost my job and couldn't immediately bounce back, he'd started treating me like I was already on that path. The criticism was his way of trying to push me to do better, to not become his brother. It came out cruel because he didn't know how else to express that fear. My mother had gone along with it because she'd been worried about me too, seeing me struggle. Bringing cheap store-bought items to gatherings when I used to make things from scratch, watching me withdraw from the family. She thought I was depressed and didn't know how to help, so she joined in the criticism, thinking maybe tough love would motivate me. She knew now how wrong that was. Emily's behavior came from competitiveness. She'd always felt like she was in my shadow when we were younger because I'd been the golden child, straight A's, full scholarship to college, great first job. When I fell from that pedestal, she'd enjoyed it more than she should have. Felt like she could finally be the successful one. My mom wasn't excusing it, just explaining it. She cried through this whole explanation, said she understood if I never forgave them, but asked me not to take it out on Skylar or my dad or Nathan. They were innocent. Skylar didn't even know what had been said. My dad might be a jerk, but he didn't deserve to lose his job at 62. Nathan had always been kind to me. I listened to all of this, and you know what I felt? Anger, because she was doing exactly what they'd always done, making excuses, reframing their cruelty as concern, asking me to consider their feelings, their circumstances, their innocence, while completely glossing over the fact that they'd spent 7 years treating me like garbage. I asked her if she'd felt concerned when she laughed about my cheap pies. If my dad was expressing fear when he called me a worthless deadbeat. If Emily was dealing with childhood issues when she said they should have cut me off years ago. If any of them had been thinking about my well-being when they were making jokes about me probably living in my car. She didn't have an answer for that. Then I asked her the question that had been bothering me since Monday. I asked her if they would have ever told me about the things they said. If I hadn't overheard them on Thanksgiving, if I'd never found out, would they have just kept treating me that way forever while pretending to my face that they cared? She was quiet for a long time. Finally admitted that probably yes, they would have kept it private because they never said those things to hurt me, just to vent frustration with each other. And if I didn't know about it, then it wasn't really hurting me, was it? That answer told me everything I needed to know. They weren't sorry they'd said those things. They were sorry I'd heard them. Sorry there were consequences. Sorry they couldn't keep mocking me behind my back while benefiting from my presence at family gatherings. I told my mother to leave. She tried to keep talking, but I stood up and walked to the door and held it open until she left. Watched her drive away, knowing that conversation had only strengthened my resolve. Thursday morning, I got a call from Gustavo. He didn't ask to meet, just launched into it over the phone. Told me I needed to be reasonable about Skylar's situation because she was about to graduate, and this could derail her entire future. I asked him if he'd been reasonable when he called me the family's failure story. He said that was different. That was just guy talk. Everyone makes jokes like that. I told him his daughter's housing wasn't my problem and hung up. He called back immediately. Started yelling about how I was being petty and vindictive and this wasn't how family treated each other. I asked him how family was supposed to treat each other exactly because based on his example, it seemed like mockery and contempt were standard. He said I was twisting his words. I said I was repeating them. He hung up on me. Thursday afternoon, Emily texted a long message about how she'd talked to Nathan and knew I'd agreed to think about his situation. Said she appreciated that and wanted to apologize for her part in everything. Said she'd been jealous and immature and had taken her insecurities out on me. Asked if we could meet for dinner to talk things through. I didn't respond. Thursday evening, my dad called, sounded defeated, said he'd talked to his boss, and the layoffs were definitely happening. He'd be unemployed by the end of January. At 62, it would be nearly impossible to find another job with comparable pay. He'd been planning to work another 3 years to build up his retirement savings. Now he'd have to tap into what little he had just to cover expenses until he could collect Social Security. He said he knew he'd been awful to me, knew he'd said unforgivable things, but he was asking me, parent to child, to please not do this, to please show mercy. He was begging. I told him I'd spent 7 years watching him show me exactly how much mercy I could expect from this family. Then I hung up. Friday, I woke up to a group text from Emily to the entire family, including me. She'd put together what she called a family meeting proposal. Suggested we all sit down with a mediator, maybe a family therapist, to work through this. Said we needed professional help to navigate this situation because clearly we couldn't handle it ourselves. Everyone else in the family had responded, agreeing it was a good idea. My mom saying she thought it was wonderful and she'd pay for the sessions. Gustavo saying he was willing to do whatever it took to fix this. My dad saying he'd participate if it meant resolving things. Even Nathan chiming in to say he supported anything that would help the family heal. And I realized they still didn't get it. They thought this was a communication problem. Thought we just needed to talk it out with a professional moderator and everything would be fixed. They were treating this like a misunderstanding that could be resolved with enough therapy and good intentions. They didn't understand that this wasn't about communication. This was about consequences. This was about them finally experiencing a fraction of the powerlessness and humiliation they'd made me feel for years. This was about them learning that you can't spend 7 years treating someone like they're worthless and then demand compassion when you need something from them. I responded to the group text with one word: no. Emily texted back immediately, asking why not. What did I have to lose by trying? Didn't I want to fix this? I told her I didn't want to fix anything. I wanted them to sit with what they'd done. Wanted them to understand that actions have consequences, and those consequences don't disappear just because you finally feel bad about what you did. My phone has been going off constantly since then. Individual texts from each family member, voicemails. Even a Facebook message from Skylar herself saying she didn't understand what was happening. But could we please talk because she was scared about losing her apartment, and her parents weren't explaining anything clearly. That one actually got to me a bit. Skylar's 22, never did anything to me, getting caught in the crossfire of her parents' cruelty. But then I remembered that she's benefited from below-market rent for 18 months without ever wondering who owned the property or why she was getting such a good deal. She's not as innocent as my mother wants me to believe. She's just young and self-centered enough not to have looked past her own good fortune. Saturday morning, I woke up to a Facebook message from my cousin Jacob. Haven't talked to him in probably 3 years. He lives 2 states over, and we were never particularly close. The message was long and rambling, but the gist was that he'd heard from Gustavo about the family situation and wanted to reach out because he'd always thought I was a good guy, and this didn't sound like me. I was confused at first about what exactly Gustavo had told him, so I asked. Jacob sent me screenshots of a group chat I wasn't part of. Turns out Gustavo had created a family-wide group text including aunts, uncles, cousins, even some family friends, and had laid out his version of events. According to Gustavo's narrative, I'd had a mental breakdown after years of unemployment and was now lashing out at the family by threatening to make everyone homeless and jobless. He said I'd developed some kind of paranoid delusion that the family didn't care about me and was using my limited financial success to punish them for imagined slights. He made it sound like I was having a psychological crisis and needed intervention. The group chat had about 30 people in it. Most of them were responding with concern, asking what they could do to help, suggesting I needed professional help. A few were more skeptical, asking for my side of the story, and a couple, including Jacob, had reached out to me directly. I sat there staring at those screenshots, feeling something I hadn't felt throughout this entire situation. Genuine shock. Because this wasn't just spin or making excuses. This was an active campaign to paint me as mentally unstable and discredit anything I might say about what actually happened. I spent Saturday morning crafting my response. Didn't post it in the group chat because I wasn't even in it, but I sent individual messages to the people who'd reached out to me directly. Gave them the actual timeline of events starting with Christmas 2018. Explained what I'd overheard on Thanksgiving. Laid out exactly what my family had been saying about me for 7 years while smiling to my face. I didn't mention the property stuff at all, just focused on the pattern of mockery and contempt. Let them draw their own conclusions about why I might be upset. Jacob responded within an hour. Said he remembered some family gatherings where the energy around me had felt weird, but he'd chalked it up to normal family dynamics. Said if what I was telling him was true, then my family's behavior was inexcusable. Asked if I had any proof, and that's when I remembered something. My phone. I'd gotten a new phone in 2020, but I'd kept my old one. And I'd taken a video at Christmas 2019. It was just supposed to be footage of my nephew opening presents, but you could hear adults talking in the background. I'd never really listened to it carefully before. I dug out my old phone, charged it up, found the video, watched it with the volume turned all the way up, and there it was, clear as day. My dad's voice asking my uncle if I'd hit anyone up for loans yet. Emily laughing and saying I probably didn't have the self-respect to ask. My mom saying something about how she hoped this was rock bottom for me because she couldn't watch me sink any lower. All of it captured in the background of an innocent Christmas video while I was in the same house, probably 15 feet away in the kitchen. I sent that video to Jacob. He watched it, called me immediately instead of texting. Said he'd had no idea the family had been treating me that way, and that Gustavo's narrative was clearly bull. Asked what he could do to help. I told him he could share the video with anyone in that group chat who wanted the truth. He said he would, and then he told me something I didn't know. Apparently Gustavo's business, he's a contractor, had been struggling for the past couple years. He'd been borrowing money from various family members to keep it afloat. Had borrowed from my parents, from my Aunt Bonnie, even from Jacob himself. Kept promising he'd pay everyone back once he landed some big contracts he had lined up. Those contracts kept not materializing. Jacob had written off the loan as money he'd never see again. But my parents apparently had loaned Gustavo almost $20,000 over the past 18 months. Money they'd been planning to use for their bathroom renovation. Money they now desperately needed back because my dad was losing his job and they'd have to stretch their savings to cover basic expenses. Gustavo couldn't pay them back. Didn't have it. Had been avoiding the conversation about repayment for months. And now with Skylar's housing crisis and his own daughter potentially having to leave school, He was even more financially strained. This context reframed everything. Gustavo wasn't just upset about Skylar's situation. He was panicking because his own financial house of cards was collapsing, and he couldn't help her even if he wanted to. And he definitely couldn't pay back my parents when they were about to need that money desperately. So he'd gone on the offensive, created that group chat, painted me as unstable, tried to rally the family to pressure me into backing down so he wouldn't have to face the consequences of his own financial mismanagement. I thanked Jacob for the information and spent the rest of Saturday watching the fallout in screenshots he kept sending me. He'd shared my video in the group chat, posted it with just a simple message saying he'd gotten my side of things, and people should watch this before making judgments. The responses were immediate and dramatic. Several family members said they felt sick hearing how my parents and siblings had talked about me. Others started questioning Gustavo's narrative about my mental state. A few tried to defend my family, saying everyone vents about relatives sometimes and it wasn't that serious. But the tide had shifted. People were asking questions now, wanting to hear more about what had actually been going on, and Gustavo was backpedaling hard, saying the video was taken out of context. That obviously it sounded bad, but families joke around like that all the time. Sunday morning, my Aunt Bonnie called me directly. She's Gustavo's wife, and I honestly expected her to go off on me for causing problems. Instead, she apologized, said she hadn't known the extent of what had been said about me over the years, said she'd been in the kitchen on Thanksgiving and had participated in that conversation and had thought they were just blowing off steam. She hadn't realized I was outside the door listening. She told me Gustavo was in over his head financially and was lashing out because he felt cornered. Said that didn't excuse his behavior but explained it. Then she asked me point blank what it would take to resolve Skylar's housing situation. I asked her why Skylar was my responsibility. She said she wasn't, but Bonnie was asking me person to person if there was anything that would make me reconsider. Not as family, just as one human to another. I told her I'd think about it. She thanked me and hung up. Sunday afternoon, Emily showed up at my door. Didn't call first, just appeared. I opened the door and she pushed past me into my house before I could say anything. Started yelling about how I'd turned the family against each other, how I'd poisoned everyone with my version of events, how I was destroying lives over my hurt feelings. I let her yell for about 2 minutes before asking if she was done. She said she wasn't. Said she had a lot more to say about my petty revenge mission and my inflated sense of victimhood. Said I'd always been oversensitive, always taken things too personally, always acted like everyone was against me, even when they were trying to help. I asked her if calling me a joke and saying they should have cut me off was her way of helping. She said I was taking that out of context, that she'd been venting after a bad day at work and had said things she didn't mean. I asked her how many bad work days she'd had over 7 years because there seemed to be a lot of venting sessions about what a loser I was. She tried a different approach. Said that even if everything I claimed was true, even if they'd been awful, what I was doing now was worse. They'd said mean things. I was actively destroying lives. Her husband was going to lose his business. My dad was going to lose his job. Skylar was going to have to drop out of school. How was that proportional? I told her she was right. It wasn't proportional because they'd spent 7 years making me feel worthless, and I was spending 7 weeks making them feel worried. They'd get over it eventually. I never really got over hearing my mother say she couldn't watch me sink any lower. Emily went quiet for a moment. Then she said something I didn't expect. She said the reason she'd been so hard on me was because she'd looked up to me growing up, and it had hurt to watch me struggle. She'd been the younger sibling who'd always tried to be like her successful older brother. When I lost my job and couldn't bounce back immediately, it had shattered something for her. Made her feel like if I could fail that dramatically, what did that mean for her own success? So she distanced herself by mocking me, by making me the punchline because it was easier than confronting her own fears about failure. She was crying by the end of this speech, said she knew it didn't excuse anything, but she wanted me to understand where it came from. Said she was genuinely sorry and would do anything to make this right. I looked at her standing in my living room crying, and I felt absolutely nothing. Because that's the thing about apologies that come when someone needs something from you. You can never know if they're real or just tactical. If she'd come to me 2 years ago and said all this when she had nothing to gain from it, maybe I would have believed her. But now, when her husband's business was on the line, it just felt manipulative. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but I needed time to think. She tried to push for more, wanted to know what I was thinking, what my timeline was, what it would take for me to forgive them. I told her I didn't know and she needed to leave. She didn't want to go, but eventually I walked to the door and held it open and she left. Monday things took another turn. I got a call from my property management company. Apparently Skylar had reached out to them directly, trying to negotiate her lease renewal. She'd put together a proposal offering to pay slightly above her current rent if they'd renew for another year. Said she could get her parents to co-sign, could provide references from professors, whatever they needed. The property manager wanted to know how I wanted to handle it. I asked them to send me Skylar's proposal. They did. It was actually pretty comprehensive. She'd clearly put work into it, had included her academic record, a budget showing she could afford the increased rent, letters of recommendation. It was the kind of thing someone does when they're genuinely scared and trying to solve their own problem. I looked over that proposal for a long time, thinking about how Skylar had been living in my property for 18 months, benefiting from below-market rent, and had never once questioned her good fortune. Thinking about how she was Gustavo's daughter, and he'd spent 7 years calling me a failure. Thinking about how she'd reached out to me on Facebook with a message that was all about her own fear, without any acknowledgement of what had led to this situation. But also thinking about how she was 22, and probably had no idea what her parents said about me behind closed doors. How she was trying to handle this herself instead of just having her parents fight her battles. How this proposal showed she wasn't expecting charity, just a chance to pay reasonable rent and finish school. I told the property manager to counteroffer. Skylar could have a 1-year lease renewal at 15% above her current rent, which was still below market rate, but not as drastically as before. No co-signers needed. She had until Friday to accept or decline. The property manager said they'd pass it along. I hung up and immediately got a call from Gustavo. He'd somehow already heard about the counteroffer, probably because Skylar had called him immediately. He was furious. Said 15% was outrageous. Said I was still trying to punish his daughter for things he'd done. Said this proved I was vindictive and unreasonable. I asked him if 15% above below market rent was really outrageous, or if he was just upset that he couldn't afford to help his daughter cover the increase because he'd mismanaged his finances and borrowed money from half the family that he couldn't pay back. He went silent. Then he asked how I knew about the loans. I said it didn't matter how I knew. What mattered was that he'd spent years calling me a failure while running his own business into the ground and borrowing money he had no ability to repay. I asked him if that made him the family's success story or their cautionary tale. He hung up on me. Tuesday, my dad showed up at my door. He looked terrible. Said he'd barely slept in days. Asked if we could talk. I let him in. We sat in my living room and he apologized. Not the kind of apologizing my mom had done where she explained and justified. Just a flat apology. Said he'd been wrong to talk about me the way he had. Wrong to treat me like a failure. Wrong to let his fear about his brother's fate color how he saw me. I asked him if he'd apologized because he was sorry or because he was losing his job. He said both. Said losing his job had made him realize how easy it was to end up in a vulnerable position through no fault of your own. Made him understand what I must have felt like 7 years ago when I lost mine. Said he wished he'd understood that then, instead of now. Then he asked me about the warehouse lease. Asked if there was any way to keep the rent from doubling so his boss could keep everyone employed. I told him the property was worth what it was worth and I wasn't going to subsidize his employer's business model. He said he understood, asked if I could at least give them 6 months instead of 2 to adjust to the new rate. Give his boss time to raise capital or restructure. I asked him why I should do that. He said because it would save 10 people's jobs, including his own, because those 10 people had families depending on them. Because even if he'd been terrible to me, those other employees hadn't done anything wrong. I told him I'd think about it. He thanked me and left. Wednesday, Nathan came by. 3rd visit from 3 different family members in 4 days, and I was getting tired of being everyone's last resort. But I let him in because Nathan had been straight with me during his first visit, and I appreciated that. He told me Emily had talked to him about her conversation with me. He'd had no idea she'd felt that way about my situation, or that she'd been dealing with those fears about failure. Said it explained a lot about their marriage, actually, about why she'd been so controlling about finances and so insistent on projecting success. She'd been terrified of ending up where she'd watched me end up. Then he asked if I'd made a decision about his lease. I told him I'd give him the same deal I was offering Skylar, a 1-year renewal at 15% above current rent. He was quiet for a long time. Then he asked if there was any room to negotiate. I said no. He asked if he could tell Emily the real situation with his business before he accepted. Said he couldn't keep lying to her anymore, and this was forcing his hand. I said what he told his wife wasn't my concern. He nodded and said he'd accept the terms. Thanked me for giving him the option at all. Then he left. Thursday morning, my property manager called again. Skylar had accepted the counteroffer, signed the new lease agreement. She'd apparently told them she was grateful for the opportunity and understood the increase was fair. She'd figure out how to make it work. Thursday afternoon, I got a text from Emily. Long message about how Nathan had told her everything about his business, and they'd spent the night talking through their finances. She said she was hurt he'd lied, but understood why. Said they were going to work through it together. Then she thanked me for giving Nathan the lease renewal at a rate he could manage. Said she knew I didn't owe them anything and she appreciated it. I didn't respond, but I appreciated that she acknowledged I didn't owe them anything. I made my decision about the warehouse property Friday afternoon. I spent Friday morning thinking about who I wanted to be at the end of this. I'd spent 7 years building myself up to have power over my family. But what was the point if using it turned me into someone just as cruel? I called my property manager and offered the warehouse owner a deal. Current rent for 6 months, then a gradual increase to 75% of market rate. Time to adjust, and a manageable final rate if he restructured properly. The warehouse owner accepted within 2 hours. My dad kept his job, so did the other 9 employees. I felt nothing except a vague sense I'd made the right choice for reasons that had nothing to do with my family. I texted my dad. He called immediately, thanking me. I cut him off and said I didn't do it for him. He asked if I'd consider coming to Christmas dinner. Everyone wanted a chance to move forward. I told him I'd think about it. Saturday, I woke up to a text from my mom. Long message about how grateful they all were. She said they were planning Christmas dinner for the following Saturday and really wanted me there. I read that text 3 times, decided I wasn't going regardless. But then Sunday happened and everything changed. Sunday afternoon, Gustavo showed up at my door alone, looking worse than I'd ever seen him. He stood on my porch and told me we needed to talk. I stepped outside and crossed my arms. He'd spent the past week thinking about his role in what happened. Said he'd been the worst of all of them, the most vicious. He wanted to explain why. When I'd lost my job 7 years ago, it had scared him. He'd been struggling with his contracting business even back then and hiding it from everyone. Seeing me, the golden child with the college degree, suddenly unemployed and struggling, made him realize how precarious everything was. So he'd gone on the offensive, made me the cautionary tale. Because as long as everyone focused on me being the loser, they weren't looking at his business numbers or asking why he kept needing to borrow money. He'd used me as a shield to hide his own failures behind. Over the years, it got worse. The more money he borrowed, the more he needed everyone to keep seeing me as the failure. Every joke about my cheap pies was him reinforcing that narrative. Now, with everything exposed, he couldn't hide anymore. Everyone could see he was the one who'd failed. Sitting with that reality had made him understand what he'd put me through. He wasn't asking for forgiveness, just wanted me to know that he understood now. Said he'd stand up at Christmas dinner and tell the whole family the truth if I wanted. Would take full responsibility publicly. I felt something shift. This wasn't tactical. Gustavo had nothing to gain. Was actually offering to make things worse for himself. I asked why he was really here. He said his daughter had called him crying after signing her lease. She'd asked why her cousin Clark was treating her this way, and he'd had to explain everything. Had to tell her about the years of mockery and cruelty. And Skylar had looked at him with complete disappointment and asked how he could have been so cruel to someone who'd never done anything to him. That look had broken something in him. We stood there in silence. Then I told him I'd go to Christmas dinner on one condition. Everyone who'd participated in mocking me had to stand up during dinner and acknowledge specifically what they'd said and why it was wrong. No generalizations, no excuses, full accountability in front of the whole family. Gustavo agreed immediately. Monday, my mom called asking if I was really coming. I confirmed. She started talking about what she'd cook. I interrupted and told her about my condition. She went quiet, said maybe we could just move forward. I told her those were my terms. Tuesday, she called back and agreed. Everyone had consented. She asked if there was anything specific I wanted served. I told her I'd bring dessert. Wednesday, I went to the bakery where I'd been buying those cheap pies for 7 years. I ordered a custom cake, told them exactly what I wanted written on it. Thursday and Friday passed in a blur. I kept replaying the past 7 years. Every family gathering, every forced smile, every cheap pie. Saturday morning, I picked up the cake and drove to my parents' house. Everyone was already there. Mom, Dad, Emily and Nathan, Gustavo and Bonnie, Skylar, Aunt Kay and Jacob, who'd flown in for this dinner. The atmosphere was tense. Everyone was overly polite. I set the cake on the kitchen counter without showing anyone what was written on it. Dinner was uncomfortable. Finally, my dad cleared his throat and said we should address the situation before dessert. Everyone moved to the living room. I stayed standing. My dad asked if I wanted to go first. I said no, I wanted to hear from them first. Gustavo stood up. He looked at me and said that for 7 years he'd called me the family failure story, made jokes about me being unemployed and pathetic, listed specific things he'd said, then explained he'd done it to deflect attention from his own failing business and pattern of borrowing money he couldn't repay, said he'd used me as a scapegoat to protect his own ego, apologized without qualifications. Emily went next. Recounted things she'd said about me being a joke and bringing cheap pies, admitted she'd enjoyed watching me struggle because it made her feel like she'd stepped out of my shadow. Apologized. My dad stood third. Listed times he'd called me a worthless deadbeat. Explained his fear, but acknowledged it didn't justify treating me like I was a lost cause. Apologized for failing as a father. My mom went last. She was crying before she stood up. Talked about laughing at my pies and saying she couldn't watch me sink lower. Said she'd been judging me. Apologized for making me feel unwelcome. When they finished, the room was silent except for my mom's crying. I stood there taking it in. They'd actually done it. Had publicly acknowledged everything. I felt something I didn't expect. Not satisfaction, more like closure. Like a weight I'd carried for 7 years had finally been acknowledged. I told them I appreciated their honesty, but I needed them to understand that apologies didn't erase 7 years of damage, didn't undo the shame and isolation I'd felt, didn't fix that I'd spent years questioning my worth. I said I'd made concessions on the properties because hurting innocent people wasn't justice. But those concessions didn't mean I was ready to pretend we were a happy family again. Just meant I'd chosen not to become someone who'd destroy others to make a point. Then I went to get the cake, set it on the coffee table. The cake read, "Every family needs their failure story, an elegant script." The room went dead silent. Gustavo's face went pale. Emily covered her mouth. My dad closed his eyes. I told them this was the cake I'd wanted to bring to Thanksgiving. The one that perfectly captured how they'd made me feel for 7 years. I'd ordered it as a reminder to myself of why I was doing all of this. But standing here now, I realized I didn't need the reminder anymore. I picked up the cake and walked into the kitchen, cut it into pieces and brought it back out, handed a slice to everyone, told them we were all going to eat it together. We were going to taste exactly what they'd fed me for 7 years. And we did. We all sat there eating that cake in complete silence. Every bite tasted like vindication, like closure. When we finished, Emily asked what happens now. Asked if we were still family or if I was done with all of them. I told her I didn't know yet. Said I needed time to figure out what relationship I wanted going forward. Maybe eventually we'd rebuild something. Maybe we wouldn't, but it would be on my terms. Gustavo asked if I'd consider having coffee with him and Skylar. Said Skylar wanted to understand what happened and apologize. I said maybe. My dad asked if I'd be at actual Christmas. I said no, I'd be spending it alone this year. My mom asked if she could hug me. I said no, not yet. I left an hour later, drove home, sat in my living room thinking about everything that had happened. My family had finally faced consequences, had been forced to acknowledge the damage they'd done, had lost the comfortable narrative where I was the failure, and they were successful. They'd been exposed, had their financial problems revealed, had to publicly admit their cruelty, and I'd proven to myself that I could have power over them without becoming them, could demand accountability without destroying innocent people. The anger I've carried for 7 years hasn't disappeared, probably never will completely, but it's different now, less consuming, more settled because they know what they did. The whole family knows. There's no more pretending, no more fake smiles over cheap pies. They wanted their family failure story. Well, they got one, just not the one they expected. I don't know what happens next with my family. Maybe we'll slowly rebuild something. Maybe not. Either way, I'm finally free of the weight of their judgment. Free of wondering what they really think of me because now I know exactly what they thought. And I know they were wrong. And honestly, That's enough. This is Trust Test Hub, where we explore real stories of trust, betrayal, and redemption. Stay tuned for more.